This week, turmoil in Sudan as heavy fighting breaks out in Khartoum. Rival generals are locked in a deadly power struggle for control of the country. What issues are at the heart of the conflict? And is Sudan headed for an all-out civil war? Our in-depth discussion begins in just a moment. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there, I'm Haydé Adams. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Sudan is in the midst of a violent conflict that erupted between the army and the paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces. Nearly 200 people have been killed in the fighting, and it could get worse, despite global calls for a ceasefire. Now there are questions about how other countries can persuade the fighters in Khartoum to lay down their arms. U.S. officials in Congress and the White House say they're using Washington's status and limited leverage to try to make peace. VOA's Anita Powell reports.
Fighting has raged in Sudan's capital since Saturday, as two of the nation's power players battle for dominance, with civilians caught in the middle. The top U.S. diplomat said he delivered a message to the heads of the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces.
This morning, I made calls to Generals al-Burhan and Hamdan, urging them to agree to a 24-hour ceasefire, to allow Sudanese to safely reunite with their families, and to obtain desperately needed relief supplies.
General Abdel-Fattah Burhan joined forces with General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hamdan, to mount a 2021 coup. But they then turned on each other. And earlier this month, protesters took to Khartoum streets after talks on a transition to civilian governance stalled. The White House says it is working hard to bring about peace, but declined to say what the consequences would be if the warring parties didn't listen.
We've been very clear about the importance of de-escalating, and you've heard Secretary Blinken speak to this. You heard my colleague from NSC speak to this as well. And so I'm just not going to go beyond to what they have said.
U.S. lawmakers familiar with the continent say the stakes are high.
I have not given up hope that there is still a path towards an end to the violence, but we need to prepare for the very real possibility that Sudan is about to descend into all-out civil war. My concern is that this may quickly become a proxy war.
Analysts say the U.S. has little room to maneuver. Washington's ties with Khartoum have long been strained, and the U.S. suspended assistance to Sudan during the 2021 coup.
Well, I think the challenge here is that the leverage that Washington has left is not leverage that it wants to put on the table, and that's the use of punitive measures. I think for the last 6 months, you've seen Washington, and even since the coup, using an engagement strategy, and an incentive strategy to try to bring the generals around to relinquishing power. The problem is that in Sudan's history, these generals don't have a history of responding to incentives. Just like they govern the country through fear, intimidation, and their own punitive measures, that's what they respond to themselves.
Kuhn says this needs to be a team effort.
We do have some leverage, but there's other players in the region that also have a lot at stake and some leverage, and we need to work with them in close coordination.
That work has begun, with the Arab League, Egypt, and the United Nations all saying they will work towards peace. But how soon can they put out the flames in Khartoum? Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
Well, civilians in the country are again caught in the crossfire, afraid and unsure of what will happen next.
The last few days have been pretty much all of us just staying inside, indoors, and trying to keep our sanity intact. Bombardments usually start around 4 a.m. and they continue on for a few hours, but today they haven't stopped. I don't know if you can hear from the background, but this has been the story for the past 4 days. We live near to the airport, which is in South Khartoum. So we're literally at the heart of the clashes between the RSF and the army. It hasn't, we can't sleep. We haven't slept in the past 4 days. We try to catch a few naps here and there, but it's not helping at all.
On a personal level, I'm at a point right now where I'm worrying every night people are going to come walk into the house trying to take whatever food we have and whatever money we have, and that's been happening all around Khartoum. And I can't really tell you which group is doing this, but it's also the longer this war lasts, the longer we're going to have people starve and people go through situations where now they have to steal and they have to try to really live. And so the thing is with Hemeti's troops right now, they're based in areas that are more neighborhoods. So once they run out of food and equipment and what they have and what they need, they're very easily will be able to walk into houses and say, give me what you have, because they've got a bigger agenda and a war to win.
Residents in Khartoum, they're holed up in their homes, telling us what everyday life is like. Now, to help us understand how and why the East African nation got to this point, I've got with me here in studio journalist Nabeel Biajo of VOA's South Sudan in Focus radio program. Nabeel is from Sudan. He knows the story and the dynamics at play very well, like the back of his hand. A warm welcome to you, Nabeel. Always great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Pity it's under these circumstances. Before we get into our Q&A here, I just want to give our viewers a little bit of context here. Now, at the heart of this conflict, as we've heard, is a power struggle between these two men. And we're going to pull up their pictures here. First, Sudan's military leader, Abdel-Fattah al-Burhan. He became the de facto leader of the country following the ouster of Omar al-Bashir. And then there is this man, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedi. He's the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, and he is one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in the country. Hard to believe now, but these two men were once friends. As mentioned earlier, they joined forces in 2019 to depose Omar al-Bashir. Now they're at odds over power and control of the country. Nabeel, we hear about the power struggle, but can you give us some insight into what is behind the power struggle? I mean, how did these two men who once collaborated now become such bitter rivals?
They collaborated in removing al-Bashir back in 2019. They both men and the institutions behind them, the army and the RSF, were part of Bashir's security architecture. And then when protests were mounting relentlessly week after week, day after day, it became clear Bashir was a liability that needed to be removed. And then they collaborated, they removed the face of the system, the regime, the head of it, but then they worked together to preserve their shared interests, which was keeping the army in control, keeping control over the country's resources, and keeping the protesters, the pro-democracy movement at bay. That's how they collaborated. But then later, from the beginning, competition was there. It was latent. They put it aside for their shared interest, because fighting from their start would have jeopardized their shared interest. Yeah.
Well, there were all these underlying tensions and a different tone here. That were we just not paying attention to it? Was it always there? I mean, is this a conflict that could have been avoided?
Yes and no. It playing out the way it has been, it's unfolding right now, could have been avoided. But then at the heart of this competition, this power grab, is the question or an issue that goes deeper into Sudan's history and a bigger problem, which is security sector reform. The role of the army and the security sector in politics. That it's a question that cannot be resolved in weeks or months or even years. So the current fighting was triggered when that question was put on the table, and then the issue of integrating the RSF into the army proved to be the sticking point, the thorny issue. And that was what made this whole thing blow up.
And you know, Nabeel, when you listen to civilian accounts, I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. People talking about how breaking their fast during Ramadan used to be this celebration, a real feast for people. But now it's hard to even eat because they are so anxious. They're just filled with anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. From the reporting that you've been doing, and of course your own relatives, friends, and connections in the country. What are people who are holed up in their homes telling you? I mean, we hear fear of looting, and then that's going to just spread. What options do people have at this moment?
Very little, unfortunately. People are trapped in their houses, and they feel rightfully so like perfect and helpless victims of this power grab between Sudan's two strongmen. Families I have spoken with are seriously considering the option of fleeing the country, leaving the country altogether, but even that is not possible. The airport is closed, roads are treacherous, people have no choice but to stay, in their homes. And speaking of civilians, what's happening in Sudan, there's a missing voice, which is the voice of the civilians, the pro-democracy movements, people who from the start didn't want al-Burhan nor Hemeti.
Who largely make up civil society?
Yes, civil society, resistance committees, protesters, just young men and women and people of different stripes. They are unable to organize now and come out and voice what they think about what's going on because of the shooting, that's going on. It's unsafe to come out and organize the kind of protests we have seen for months, in fact years, leading up to the toppling of Bashir and afterwards. But then people in Sudan I speak with, and as well as analysts, they say, like, when people are able to come out, what we expect is that they say we condone the actions of neither Burhan nor Hemeti. We support neither. And in fact, this is more evidence that neither Burhan nor Hemeti should be in power. The whole military should exit power, and they should be reformed and put under a civilian administration.
And do you think there will come a moment where we will start seeing people rise up and protests again?
Now it's difficult. Now families are trapped across different parts of Khartoum. You can't even get from point A to point B.
Organizing is really hard.
My own family is separated, and people are, for example, if the fighting on Saturday morning caught you in Durman, like the west side of Khartoum, you couldn't cross the bridge and go south, for example, to Al-Kalakla. If it caught you in Khartoum North in Bahri, you couldn't cross the bridge, come to Khartoum South. So movement is severely restricted. People cannot come out. Even humanitarian organizations cannot provide assistance to people who are wounded. They cannot even collect dead bodies lying in the street.
Wow, these are dangerous times indeed. Nabeel, Biajo, thank you so very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. I wish we could get to more, but we'll keep discussing this after a little later on in the show. Well, we asked our social media followers to weigh in, and here's the question we asked. How should the international community respond to the conflict in Sudan? And here are some of the comments that we received. Well, John Makorpu Tamanja from Accra, Ghana says, the African Union should take the lead, get into the country, use traditional diplomacy to secure a win-win situation for all. Yesterday, Ibra from Entebbe in Uganda believes Western countries should stay away from African issues. And of course, Riak Garang from South Sudan says the international community should back the current efforts by South Sudan's President Salva Kiir to bring the two warring parties to a common understanding, support the Juba Peace Agreement and the team of IGAD, which is of course the Intergovernmental Authority Development, which is an 8-country East Africa regional bloc. And we thank you so much for your comments. Keep following us on social media and share your comments with us and answer those questions we have posted there. And that is what we will discuss after the break, the international implications and the prospects for peace. My guest is Alex Duval. He is standing by. Is Sudan headed for all-out civil war? Can this conflict be resolved? And soon, that conversation is up next.
From around the world. Let's go.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain, And what we hear doesn't reflect what we see. We seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. Our focus this week is the deadly conflict in Sudan, a power struggle between Sudan's army and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group, or RSF. Now, this conflict has serious political implications, not just for the people of that country, but geopolitically. And let's delve now into what is at stake for world powers. I'm going to bring in my guests. I'm joined from Boston, Massachusetts, by Alex Duval. He is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He's also a former advisor to the African Union on Sudan. Alex, a warm welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Thank you so much, and what a great pleasure, privilege and honor it is to have you on the show. Alex, was there a sense of foreboding when it came to this conflict? I mean, given the tensions between the military and the RSF, could anyone have foreseen that it would spill out into the kind of conflict we see now?
There had been fears precisely that this conflict would erupt ever since the revolution that overthrew Omar al-Bashir some 4 years ago. And over the last few weeks, the tensions were rising with the mobilization of different forces from the two sides in Khartoum and in other places. And the Sudanese generals have a way of saying that conflict is inevitable, of abdicating their own responsibility for taking that critical decision to go to war. And that sense of fatalism, which is actually entirely false. This is a clear decision by these two men. But that sense of fatalism, that sense of foreboding was really looming over Sudan in the last weeks.
And of course, a lot of this is about two very prominent personalities. And Alex, I came across a piece you wrote in The Conversation titled Hamedi, the warlord who built a paramilitary force more powerful than the state. And in it, you call Hamedi a specialist in violence and quote, the face of Sudan's violent political marketplace. Please give us some top lines about him and how he was able to build this powerful paramilitary force. I mean, this is a man who was essentially a political outsider, not very educated. It's worth looking into who he was and how he rose through the ranks.
Indeed, and I think many of your viewers will recall the dreadful war and massacres in Darfur 20 years ago. And this is where it started, because in response to fighting insurgency in Darfur, the Sudanese army was not able to contain the rebels, and it did what it always did, which is it turned to local militia, in this case the notorious Arab Janjaweed, to fight the war on its behalf. And in doing so, it sowed the wind, and the whirlwind is Hemeti and the Rapid Support Forces that grew out of that counterinsurgency. A very capable, effective militia commander, also a businessman, a man who took control of most of Sudan's artisanal gold production, which is in Darfur, and the export of that gold, built himself a powerful commercial family-owned business, was able to use his money, what the Sudanese call his political budget, to buy up different players, different rivals, different militia, to the stage where he was in. He was as powerful as the army and could contend for the leadership of the country.
Alex, political friends falling out. I mean, in the world of politics, that is, of course, nothing new. But what does the relationship and the dynamics of the relationship between these two men really say about Sudan's politics, about its dynamics, the features of Sudanese politics?
Well, they're both military leaders, and they're both kleptocrats. They're both in charge of commercial empires, slightly different in each case. But nonetheless, what's happened is that this sort of military commercial machine has swallowed the Sudanese economy and much of Sudanese society. No one knows how much money they're actually leeching out of the state budget and out of the country. And each of them has their external backers too. And the Sudanese nation and the interests of Sudanese civilians in democracy are simply being swallowed up in this struggle for power and wealth.
Alex, what is your take on the prospect of all-out civil war? Is that what we're staring in the face, or is there some potential or hope for peace?
I think in the short term, in the coming days, the two men who decided on the beginning of this war can stop it if they so wish. And that comes down to their calculation and the pressure brought on them. If that doesn't happen, then I think we're likely to see two things. One is that the conflict between the two will metastasize into a much broader conflict. At the moment it's a struggle for power, it could become an ethnic conflict with all the violence against civilians that would entail. And the other thing is that they both have external backers and patrons with their interests. Al-Burhan is aligned with Egypt, Hemeti is aligned with the United Arab Emirates and with Eritrea, and they could these outside interests could very readily be drawn in, and making the conflict that much more intractable.
Alex, how did this country get here? I mean, what essentially went wrong with Sudan's revolution? I mean, in 2019, all eyes were on this country. There was some semblance of hope that real change was about to take place, that people could look forward to an absolutely new chapter. But, this was a revolution that ousted a strong man, but then saw coups and political instability follow. What went wrong here?
There were a number of things that went wrong, but one of the absolutely key factors was that when the civilian government was sworn into office in August of 2019, it was not given the essential tools to tackle the underlying problems. The most important was that it was not given debt relief and the removal of sanctions. The approach of the former administration, the Trump administration, was that it would bargain with Sudan, and it would only lift sanctions and normalize economic relations when it got something in return. And the thing in return was normalization of relations with Israel. The US administration had outsourced its policy to Sudan, to Israel, to Egypt, to the Saudis and to the Emiratis, and none of those four were interested in democracy in Sudan, and by extension neither was the US, whatever its words. And when there was the coup of 18 months ago, the US found itself really giving only a slap on the wrist to the generals. It didn't engage with the level of heavyweight diplomacy that was necessary to walk Sudan back from the crisis that was clearly enveloping.
What about regional powers here as well? And by region, I mean in East Africa. We saw IGAD, that 8-member bloc, sending the presidents of South Sudan, of Djibouti and Kenya to go and mediate. You, Alex, were an advisor to the African Union on Sudan. What would your advice be to the African Union today?
Well, some years ago, 10, 12 years ago, the African Union was a major actor, a major player, and it was able to align all the different international players. It had the clout to, at the time, Ethiopia was an anchor of stability and could act in support, could provide peacekeepers, it could get the United States and China and Russia to cooperate, it could pass a resolution through the Peace and Security Council that would then overcome whatever divisions there were at the United Nations and get the international community not only to speak with one voice but actually to act together. That unity has I'm afraid, fragmented. The diplomatic world is not acting cohesively. So, in principle, the Africans could take a leadership role, but there's a lot of very hard diplomatic work to be done if they are to step up to the plate.
Very briefly, we have about 1 minute here. We heard U.S. Senator Chris Coons talk about fears of proxy war breaking out here. Whose proxies are we talking about?
I think there's a very immediate fear that Sudan could get dragged into the wider conflict in the Nile Valley that involves Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Egypt, and that would be bad news across all of Africa and the Middle East.
Alex Duval, what a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for your insights. This was really fascinating, and thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. Our guest this week was Alex Duval from Tufts University, also the former advisor to the African Union on Sudan. And that is our show for this week. Thank you again to my guests, and a big thanks to you for sharing your thoughts and comments on social media. And thank you for always watching and always listening. And I will see you next time. Goodbye.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.